Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it is that you're joining me for this video. Thanks once again for clicking on the PenBoyRoy Fountain Pen Review channel video. This video, I just want to talk about feeds. I'm going to talk about the industry standard feeds. There are three main feeds that we see very often in fountain pens nowadays. I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to discuss them, the positive and negatives. I'm also going to talk about why feeds are important and how they affect the writing experience with pens that we see today. For each feed, I have a corresponding pen that utilizes said feed. So let me start with the first one. The first one here is what I call the cheapy plastic feed. I call it the cheapy plastic feed because it seems very generic, and you see them from fountain pens ranging from $5 all the way up to high-end fountain pens with gold nibs and whatnot. It's very identifiable. Usually you only see it from the bottom. Let's check out a pen with it. This is the Giant Sequoia in green, and that is what the feed looks like when it's in the nib unit. The next feed is the Jowo feed. This is the Jowo feed over here. These are typically found in pens that utilize Jowo nibs with Jowo nib unit housings. This is the top. This is the portion that's covered by the nib, and this is the bottom. These all have very distinct looks. And then here is a fountain pen that I'm using to demonstrate what it looks like. This is what it looks like when it's in the nib unit. This is the Montegrappa Fortuna Grigio Orancio fountain pen, a Pen Chalet exclusive. I like it. Looks like molten rock or something. Okay. And now, stay still. The next one is the Bach feed. This is what the top of the feed looks like. This is the portion that's covered by the nib, and this is what the bottom looks like. Again, they all look like feeds, but they all have their own distinct look. And these feeds are often found in nib units that utilize Bach nibs and nib unit housings, such as one of my favorites here. This is the Leonardo Officina Italiana Fiora in yellow. And that's what that looks like. Okay, so let me discuss first the differences of these. Stop rolling. Okay, let me discuss first the differences. Now, the two outer ones, the cheapy plastic feed and the Bach feed, are similar in that they are hard plastic. There's no give, right? They're just stiff, they're hard. That's all there is to it. Bach feed, stiff, hard, that's all there is to it. The Jowo feed, on the other hand, is kind of like a spring. It has just a little bit more give. And I think that plays a huge role when it comes to providing ink to the nibs. I'll explain that to you in a little bit. But let me start first with the cheapy plastic feed. What I really want to demonstrate here to you is, or rather show you, is this feed has a double ink channel, meaning you have the little pipe here that draws the ink from the ink source, and then it goes up into two slits that go along the entire length of the feed, and those two slits are what feed the tines of the nib. Now, believe it or not, having a double ink channel is not actually optimal. And the reason why is this. Let me find a nib lying around. The reason why is this. As you know, this is a nib, okay? Now, the nib has a slit that goes down the middle, and that slit needs to be provided with ink. With a double ink channel feed, you have two things that work against it. The first thing is, since there's two ink channels, those two ink channels that run up and down the feed are very narrow. In addition to being very narrow, in order for the two ink channels to feed the tine slit with ink, it has to take an extra step. It has to cross over the space between the two ink channels in order to feed the tine slit with ink. Now that's different from our Jowo feed. As you can see here, the Jowo feed has only one ink channel that runs along the length of the feed. And it's a thicker ink channel. And the reason why that's a benefit, and the reason why that behooves the pen, is because of this. Since it's only one ink channel, it doesn't require the extra step of crossing over to another ink channel and meet the ink in the middle to provide the tines with ink. So this single ink channel will just immediately feed the time slit instead of, like I said, bridge a barrier between the two ink channels in order to feed it. If that makes any sense. I'm hoping I'm making sense. This is not an easy thing to discuss or explain. So now let's go to our Bach feed. The Bach feed, like the Jowo feed, shares the benefit of one ink channel. So basically you have the one ink channel that's feeding the time slit directly instead of like the cheapy plastic feed. You got the two, it has to cross over that middle barrier and then feed the ink channel. I'm sorry, nib tines. So there's that. In the case of ink flow, the Jowo feed and the Bach feed are the preferable feeds because it's a single ink channel that provides direct ink to the nib tines. The least preferable is the double ink channel because if for some reason, for whatever reason, maybe the ink isn't flowing through the feed enough, it's not providing enough ink to each of the two channels, then it won't be able to merge the two ink channels and feed the nib tines. Now there's another thing I want to talk about. The shape of the feed. With the cheapy plastic feed, you have a completely flat surface. Do you see that? It's just flat. Now the reason why this is not optimal is because unless you have a completely flat nib, let's say this awesome sticker, the greatest sticker ever made in the history of anything ever made, unless the nib itself is completely flat, then you're going to have a problem with capillary action. For example, like let's take a look at this feed. Now let's say that the nib has a slight contour. See how I'm bending this sticker? What's going to happen is you see that space and the contour of our fake nib here? That space is going to interrupt the capillary action that's bringing the ink to the nib tines. Like I said, if the nib is flat, no big deal. But oftentimes you have nibs that are contoured and that interrupts the ink channel. Now, because it's flat and it doesn't bend at all, the nib won't be able to force the feed to conform with its shape. And this is why I find the Jowo feed to be beneficial. Because even though this also is flat, remember how I said it was more bendy? Excuse my technical terms. Since it's more bendy, let's say you have a nib that's just a little bit more contoured. What it will do is it will actually force the feed to bend to its will. You like how I said that? It's going to bend it to its will, and it's going to make the feed conform to it just a little bit more. Now in the case of Jowo nibs do have slight contour to the shape of the nib. So it's essential that if that's the case and the nib is pushing up against the feed, it forces the feed to conform with the nib's shape. Now with the Bach feed, we also have a hard plastic feed. It's flat and it's straight. But a lot of times that's not an issue for Bach nibs, and the reason why is because Bach nibs, unlike the Jowo nibs, they're more straight. So like I was saying before, unless the nib is straight, you're going to have an issue. Here, this is a typical shape of a Jowo nib. This is a Bach nib. It's usually straight, so it doesn't give you an issue. Now, with the cheapy plastic feed, with the Jowo feed being more springy and as having a single ink channel, and then the Bach feed having a single ink channel, I would say if I had to order these in best to worst, this would be the best, second best, and this one would be the worst. So again, the Jowo feed is the best feed. The Bach feed, in my opinion, is the second best, and then the cheapy plastic feed is the worst. And like I said, it's just because of the shape and the ink channels. So let's take the two best ones. Let's take the Jowo feed and the Bach feed and compare them, and let's discuss why the Jowo feed is better. Well, the Jowo feed also has these fish eyes that can act as a reservoir for ink. Those get filled up and supply the tines with a little bit more ink, whereas the Bach feed doesn't have that reservoir. Where the Bach beats the Jowo nib, where the Bach feed beats the Jowo feed is right here. This one's a hard one to see. Do you see those ink channel pipes right there? Do you notice how the Bach one on the right is just a touch longer than the one on the left, the Jowo feed? This is a benefit for the Bach feed, and the reason being, this feed channel extends further into the ink source, whether it be a cartridge, converter, piston filler. And because it extends further into the ink source, it touches the ink faster and initiates a quicker draw of ink into the feed. Whereas in the Jowo feed, it doesn't extend as far into the ink source. Now, with the housings, just know that when these feeds and nibs are put into the housing has a collar that wraps around this pipe. And with the cheapy plastic feed and the Jowo feed, the pipe ends right at the end of the pipe, what I'm calling the pipe. With the Bach feed, the collar ends before the end of the pipe, resulting in more pipe in the ink source touching the ink and initiating a quicker draw of ink into the feed. So in that sense, the Bach feed is better, but overall, the best feed of them all is, I think, the Jowo feed. The Jowo feed, like I said, because the feed is softer and conforms to the shape of the nib more and doesn't interrupt the capillary action of the fountain pen. Again, the cheapy plastic feed, the benefit that it has over these other two is probably because they're cheaper, and that's a big reason why manufacturers choose to go with that over the other two. So that was just my overview of the 3 different types of feeds. There are other types of feeds, but this one is just the most common. And I wanted to show them to you because a lot of times we don't understand, why is our nib not working? And it doesn't have everything to do with the nib. Sometimes it has a lot to do with the feed. So I hope I added some clarity to that whole issue. If you have any questions, please post and I'll do my best to get back to you guys. I'm not the best because I'm busy. I'm not the best at getting back sometimes, but when I have the time, I go out on a spree. So thanks again for watching. Love you guys. Be well, be safe.